The year is 258 AD, and the heart of the Roman Empire pulses with the rhythm of power, fear, and the silent hum of a civilization on the edge of transformation. Amidst the chaos of an empire stretched thin by economic strain, foreign invasions, and internal dissent, one man stands at the center of an unspeakable spectacle. His name is Lawrence, a Christian deacon whose faith is about to be tested in the most unimaginable way. He is bound, naked, and stretched over an iron griddle, a slow, searing death waiting for him. The flames lick at his skin, and the heat grows unbearable. Yet Lawrence does not scream. He does not beg for mercy. Instead, as the fire burns deeper into his flesh, he smiles. "Turn me over," he says, his voice steady, as if he were ordering a meal. "I'm done on this side." The crowd, gathered to witness his suffering, gasps in disbelief. What they expected to be a display of brokenness, a final, humiliating act to extinguish the flame of Christianity, is turning into something altogether unexpected. Lawrence, the man they thought would collapse in agony, continues to mock his executioners, turning their cruelty into his triumph. His calm defiance against the brutal power of the empire becomes a challenge to everything the Romans believed about strength, fear, and submission. This is no mere act of martyrdom. It is an extraordinary moment where the unthinkable happens. A man, burnt alive by the most sophisticated instruments of Roman torture, refuses to be broken. He laughs in the face of death, and with every agonizing moment, he transforms his torment into a declaration of divine power, leaving his executioners bewildered and the crowd questioning the very foundations of Roman authority. In that one moment, Lawrence becomes more than a martyr. He becomes a symbol, not of Christian weakness, but of strength beyond the reach of any empire. What was intended to be his end becomes instead the beginning of something greater than even the Roman Empire could destroy. Part 1. The Empire on the Edge. In the midst of the vast, crumbling Roman Empire, a kingdom stretched thin by endless wars, economic turmoil, and the growing shadows of internal rebellion, the heart of power beats with a rhythm of fear. The emperor, Valerian, is desperately clinging to his empire's waning strength, yet his rule is being challenged from within. Barbarian tribes at the borders press in, while Rome itself faces rising discontent. But the most insidious threat, one that strikes at the very foundation of Roman identity, comes from within its own walls: the spread of Christianity. Once a fringe movement, Christianity has grown exponentially over the past few decades, becoming not just a religious sect, but a social force. More and more Romans, from slaves to soldiers, from the poorest of the poor to the nobility, are abandoning the imperial gods and embracing the new faith. This new religion, with its insistence on a single, all-powerful God and refusal to worship the emperor as a deity, directly challenges Roman authority. For the rulers of Rome, this cannot be tolerated. Emperor Valerian, a man who inherited a divided empire, sees in this new faith not just a theological challenge, but an existential one. To him, Christianity's rejection of Roman customs is an act of rebellion, and rebellion must be crushed with force. In the years leading up to 258 AD, Valerian unleashes the full weight of Roman power on the Christian community. Unlike his predecessors who had waged sporadic local persecutions, Valerian embarks on a systematic campaign of religious genocide, an effort to root out Christianity at its very core. His decree is simple: arrest the clergy, strip the church of its wealth, and break the spirit of every Christian who dares defy the imperial gods. Priests, bishops, and deacons are executed without mercy. Christian cemeteries are desecrated, and religious gatherings are outlawed. The Christian church, once thriving in the shadows, is now in the crosshairs of an empire determined to see it eradicated. But what Valerian doesn't foresee is the power of the Christian faith, not just to endure suffering, but to transform it. In the midst of this campaign, a man named Lawrence rises to prominence. A deacon in the Christian church, Lawrence holds the keys to the church's wealth and its charitable network. He is not a warrior or a scholar, but a man with a mind for organization, a heart for the poor, and a spirit unyielding in the face of persecution. Lawrence, more than anyone, understands the stakes. As the empire seeks to dismantle the Christian faith, he finds himself at the center of the storm. The arrest of Pope Sixtus II, his beloved leader, and the execution of several deacons send shockwaves through the Christian community of Rome. Lawrence, now one of the last remaining leaders, is thrust into a position of unimaginable responsibility. The empire has set its sights on him, and he knows that his fate, like that of his fellow Christians, lies in the hands of the Romans. This is not a simple matter of survival. It is a war of ideologies, a battle for the soul of an empire. And in this struggle, Lawrence's role is clear. He must protect the treasures of the church, not just its gold and silver, but its very soul. Part 2. The Rise of Lawrence. Lawrence's journey to this fateful moment began far from the marble halls of Rome, in the sun-drenched hills of Hispania, where the Roman Empire's reach had mingled with the traditions of the local people to create a unique Christian community. Born around 225 AD, Lawrence grew up in a world where Roman authority was both a distant ideal and a brutal reality. But what set Lawrence apart was not his physical strength or military prowess, but his keen mind and his deep commitment to service. From a young age, Lawrence was drawn to the church, not for mystical visions or divine encounters, but for his natural talent in organization and leadership. In a region marked by strife and division, where Christianity was still struggling to find its footing, Lawrence's gifts for managing people and resources made him an invaluable asset. His rise was not meteoric, but steady, built on the foundation of practical wisdom and a quiet faith that would one day carry him to the highest echelons of the Christian hierarchy. It was on a visit to Hispania that Pope Sixtus II first encountered Lawrence. Recognizing the young man's extraordinary abilities, Sixtus extended an invitation to Lawrence to join him in Rome, where the church was beginning to emerge as a powerful force. To Lawrence, the offer was both a dream and a risk, a chance to serve in a city that was, on the surface, both the heart of the ancient world and a land of peril for Christians. Arriving in Rome in the early 250s, Lawrence was quickly swept up into the complex, often dangerous workings of the Roman Church. The Christian community in Rome, though small, was powerful, with deep ties to both the rich and the poor. It was a community built on charity, feeding the hungry, caring for widows and orphans, ransoming prisoners, and providing burial for the dead. Lawrence's administrative acumen made him the natural choice for a position that would become crucial in the church's survival: chief deacon, the de facto treasurer of the Christian community. Lawrence's role as deacon was far more significant than many might realize. It was not just about managing the finances of the church, it was about ensuring that the church's charitable works could continue despite the constant threat of persecution. As the chief steward of the church's resources, Lawrence was responsible for overseeing its vast charitable network, ensuring that the wealth of the church was used to support its most vulnerable members. Under his guidance, the Christian church in Rome grew both in wealth and influence, creating a foundation of support for thousands of people across the empire. But with great power came great danger. As Christianity spread, so too did the eyes of the Roman authorities. The wealth that Lawrence helped to manage became both a blessing and a curse. The Roman prefects, ever watchful of the empire's enemies, saw in the growing Christian community not just a religious movement, but a potential threat to Roman power. And Lawrence, as the keeper of Christian wealth, became the most visible target for the empire's wrath. The tension in Rome was palpable. On the surface, Christians could live relatively peacefully, conducting their affairs, raising families, and even holding minor positions of authority. But beneath this fragile peace was an ever-present threat. A single wrong move, a whisper in the wrong ear, or a change in imperial policy could turn ordinary Christian citizens into hunted criminals overnight. And when Valerian's edict came down in 257 AD, the hammer of persecution fell hard. Emperor Valerian, in his desperation to maintain control over the crumbling empire, issued a decree aimed directly at the heart of the Christian community. The church, with its growing wealth and increasingly organized structure, posed a direct challenge to Roman religious supremacy. Valerian's solution was both simple and brutal. Eliminate the Christian leadership, confiscate their wealth, and break the will of the people. The edict was not a scattered or haphazard attack. It was a methodical, empire-wide assault aimed at the clergy, the bishops, presbyters, and deacons who kept the Christian community intact. Lawrence, as one of the highest-ranking Christian leaders, found himself at the center of this storm. The Roman authorities would soon come for him. He knew it was only a matter of time before the empire would try to silence the church by taking away its leaders, its strength, and its wealth. And Lawrence, ever calm and calculated, understood the full scope of the challenge he faced. As Valerian's campaign of persecution began in earnest, the Christian community braced itself for what would surely be a brutal reckoning. The arrest and execution of Pope Sixtus II on August 6, 258, sent shockwaves through the church. It was not just a death. It was a symbol, a calculated strike at the heart of the Christian movement. Lawrence, who had been absent during the Pope's arrest, now found himself not only the most senior Christian official in Rome, but a man on the run. He had become, in essence, the last hope for a community on the brink of collapse. This was not the time for Lawrence to hide. With the mantle of responsibility heavier than ever, he knew that his fate would determine the future of the Christian church in Rome. The empire wanted him dead. But Lawrence was not simply going to die, he was going to make sure that his death and the death of his beloved Pope Sixtus would not be in vain. As the empire closed in on him, Lawrence began to make his plans. He knew what was coming, and he knew what needed to be done. The wealth of the church had to be protected. The people, the treasures of the faith, had to be safeguarded. And above all, the spirit of the church had to remain unbroken. Lawrence had already lived a life of service, but now he was preparing to make the ultimate sacrifice, a sacrifice that would transcend even death itself. Part 3. The Confrontation. On August 6, 258 AD, a thunderous blow struck the Christian community in Rome. Pope Sixtus II, Lawrence's beloved leader, was arrested alongside several deacons during a clandestine Christian service held in the underground catacombs of San Callisto. It was a trap laid by the Roman authorities, designed to catch the church leadership in violation of the imperial edicts. The timing was precise. Sixtus and his companions had been targeted not just for their religious leadership, but for their refusal to comply with the demands of the empire. They were defying the Roman gods, and this defiance could not go unpunished. The execution of Sixtus VI sent a shockwave through the Christian community, reverberating through the narrow streets and alleys of Rome. His death was meant to be a statement, an unmistakable signal to Christians everywhere that their faith, their leaders, and their way of life were no longer tolerated. But it also created a power vacuum. Lawrence, the chief deacon and treasurer of the Christian church, was now the highest-ranking Christian leader still alive in Rome. His responsibility was overwhelming. Thousands of Christians, both those who had been openly defying the emperor and those who had been quietly practicing their faith, looked to him for leadership, guidance, and protection. His position made him both the most important man in the Christian community and the most hunted man in the empire. The Roman authorities, led by the prefect of Rome, were not content with simply executing Pope Sixtus and his deacons. They knew that the real heart of the Christian movement lay in its resources, the treasures Lawrence guarded. The Christian church, though still technically an outlawed religion, had amassed wealth through donations, charity, and its network of believers. This wealth, combined with its growing influence, was seen as both a threat and a prize. The Roman authorities were determined to seize it, and Lawrence, with his knowledge of the church's assets, was the key. The prefect summoned Lawrence to his residence under the guise of an interrogation. This meeting, however, was not an attempt to extract information. It was a calculated move meant to force Lawrence into submission. The Romans, with their centuries of imperial rule and sophisticated understanding of power dynamics, believed they could manipulate Lawrence. They offered him a deal: surrender the treasures of the church and he would be spared. It was a tempting proposition, survival in exchange for betrayal. But Lawrence, ever resolute, saw through the offer. He knew that to betray the church would be to betray everything he had worked for, everything he believed in. The conversation between Lawrence and the prefect was not a negotiation. It was a test. Lawrence, seeing the inevitable, decided to outsmart the Romans in a way they never expected. Instead of revealing the treasures of the church as they hoped, he asked for 3 days to gather them. The prefect, believing he had secured a cooperative prisoner, granted the request, unaware that he had just walked into Lawrence's trap. During those 3 days, Lawrence worked tirelessly. He did not gather gold or silver, nor did he seek to protect the material wealth of the church. Instead, he did something far more profound. He took the treasures of the church the wealth that had been entrusted to him, and gave it all away. He distributed the gold, the silver, and the precious items among the poor, the widows, the orphans, the slaves, and the outcasts. To Lawrence, these were the true treasures of the church, not the material wealth that could be seized, but the human lives the church had touched and saved. As he worked, Lawrence knew his time was running out. He was not just protecting the church's wealth, he was preparing for his final confrontation. He understood that when he returned to the prefect, he would face his death, but he also knew that his death would carry far more significance than any execution could achieve. He was ready to make the ultimate sacrifice, not just for his faith, but for the future of Christianity itself. On the third day, Lawrence returned to the prefect's residence, as promised. The Roman officials, expecting him to arrive with chests filled with gold, were greeted instead by a procession of the city's poorest residents, the blind, the crippled, the widowed, and the orphaned. These were the true treasures of the Christian faith, and Lawrence, with a calmness that defied the situation, gestured to the crowd and declared, "These are the treasures of the church." The prefect's face turned red with rage. This was not the submission he had expected. Lawrence had turned the tables on him, taking the Roman idea of treasure, wealth, power, and status, and flipping it on its head. The people the Romans had discarded, the ones they saw as worthless and beneath contempt, were now the ones that Lawrence held up as the most valuable. It was an act of defiance so powerful that even the hardened Roman officials could not ignore its implications. The prefect, humiliated by Lawrence's audacity, reacted swiftly. The church's material wealth was no longer the issue. Lawrence's continued defiance was. In his anger and frustration, the prefect decided that Lawrence must die. His execution would send the message that Roman authority could not be mocked, not even by a Christian deacon. What followed was not just an execution. It was a public spectacle, a display of imperial power meant to break the spirit of the Christians once and for all. Lawrence, the man who had outwitted the Romans and mocked their authority, would now be subjected to one of the most brutal and public forms of execution in the Roman Empire, roasting alive on a gridiron. The authorities believed this would be the end of him, that his body would crumble and his spirit would break. But they underestimated the strength of his faith. Part 4. The Execution and the Defiance. The day arrived with an ominous stillness that hung over the crowd in the Forum of Rome, the heart of imperial spectacle. Word had spread that Lawrence, the defiant Christian deacon who had mocked the power of Rome itself, was about to face his gruesome execution. The imperial authorities, in their wisdom, had devised a slow and deliberate death, a public spectacle that would strip Lawrence of his humanity and break the spirit of any Christian who might dare to resist the empire. He would be roasted alive on a gridiron, the metal instrument designed to sear the flesh and burn the body in such a way that death would come not in an instant, but in prolonged agony. The crowd, as it always did when imperial punishments were carried out, gathered in anticipation. For the Romans, public executions were both a tool of control and a form of entertainment. They came to watch, not in pity, but to witness the power of the empire and the weakness of those who dared to defy it. Yet today, they were about to witness something that would shake their very understanding of strength, endurance, and defiance. Lawrence was brought forward, his body already bruised from previous torture, his hands bound behind him. His executioners, seasoned professionals in the art of cruelty, positioned him above the glowing embers of a carefully tended fire. The gridiron was prepared with ruthless precision. Its iron bars gleamed, each one positioned to sear his flesh as the flames beneath would rise, intense and controlled. The Romans knew how to break men. They had perfected the art of suffering. Yet Lawrence, who had outwitted them once, remained calm. There was no fear in his eyes, no terror at the pain to come. Instead, there was an odd serenity, a quiet acceptance that seemed to make his captors uneasy. As the heat from the fire began to lick at his skin, the crowd braced for the screams, the usual signs of submission that would mark the end of resistance. But they did not come. What the crowd heard instead was something far more disorienting. Lawrence, his back pressed against the burning metal, began to speak, not in anguish, but with clarity, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "You think you're cooking me," Lawrence said, his words defiant, his tone calm. "But you are only making me more tender." It was a statement so full of both humor and contempt that it rattled the crowd. This man, stretched on a gridiron being roasted alive, was not giving in to pain. He was not screaming. He was speaking with the confidence of someone who had already won. He continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "Turn me over. I'm done on this side." The words hung in the air as if he were ordering a meal, not begging for mercy. The soldiers who were tasked with his execution, expecting his screams to drown out any other sounds, found themselves confused and shaken. The torture that was supposed to break him, that was supposed to demonstrate the utter powerlessness of those who opposed Rome, was not achieving its desired effect. Instead, Lawrence was turning the tables not just on his executioners, but on the very idea of Roman power. As the flames grew hotter and the iron seared deeper into his flesh, Lawrence's calm defiance only increased. He spoke to his executioners as if they were the ones undergoing the torment. He offered them advice on how to make the process easier for him, as though the flames and the pain were mere inconveniences. To the Romans, accustomed to the agony of their victims being so palpable that it crushed any hope of resistance, Lawrence's conduct was a profound anomaly. They had never seen a man so resolute, so unwavering, in the face of such exquisite agony. The gridiron burned through his skin, leaving patterns of scorched flesh in its wake. The smell of burning human flesh filled the air, and still Lawrence did not falter. The Romans had expected him to break, to collapse in terror or desperation, but instead he seemed to grow stronger, his resolve unshaken. It was as if the more they burned him, the more his spirit became an immovable force, standing tall against the Roman Empire itself. A few minutes into his torment, Lawrence looked up at his torturers, now visibly unsettled, and said, "You may kill me, but you cannot take my soul." The crowd, a mix of curious bystanders, Roman soldiers, and Christians, began to shift uncomfortably. What had begun as a clear display of Roman superiority was now turning into a spectacle of something much more profound. Those who had come expecting to witness the submission of a Christian were instead watching a man endure a torment that should have shattered him. And instead, he was speaking with clarity, with wit, with dignity. Some spectators in the crowd whispered nervously among themselves, "What was this?" What did it mean that this man, a deacon of a foreign religion, could endure such pain and still mock his torturers? Some even began to question whether Lawrence was under the protection of some divine force. Could it be that his God was more powerful than the Roman gods? The Romans, shaken by what they were witnessing, could not allow this defiance to continue. They had seen many men die in the most excruciating ways, but none had ever faced death like this, with such defiant calm. As Lawrence's body began to falter, exhausted by the heat and the burning pain, he looked up once more and addressed the Roman prefect, the one who had ordered his death. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity to show my God's glory," he said, his voice firm, clear, and filled with a peace that defied logic. "May the Roman Empire be converted just as I am." With those final words, Lawrence's life slipped away. His death was not an end, but a testimony. The fire that consumed his body could not touch the soul of the man who had endured it, and what was meant to be his greatest humiliation became his most profound victory. The Romans, who had set out to extinguish the Christian faith, had instead witnessed a victory of the human spirit that would reverberate throughout the empire. The crowd, now silent, was left to contemplate the mystery of what they had just witnessed. For the first time, the power of Rome had been shown to have limits, limits that even the might of the empire could not conquer. The martyrdom of Lawrence did not end with his death. It marked the beginning of a movement that would ultimately transform the very empire that sought to destroy it. Part 5. The Aftermath and Legacy. The heat of Lawrence's execution still hung in the air, a sickly, metallic scent that clung to the streets of Rome long after the flames had died. The public spectacle that was meant to be the final word on Christian defiance had instead become a profound challenge to the very foundation of Roman authority. The Romans, who had orchestrated his slow, excruciating death, were now left with a crisis they hadn't anticipated. A martyr who refused to be broken, a death that, instead of silencing Christianity, had made it stronger. In the hours following Lawrence's execution, the imperial authorities scrambled to disperse the crowd. They feared what might follow: riots, uprisings, or even worse, a widespread questioning of the empire's authority. Roman officials knew that public opinion was a volatile thing, and the events of the day had shattered the narrative they had so carefully constructed, that Roman power in all its glory and cruelty could crush any opposition, even the most defiant faith. But the damage had been done. Stories of Lawrence's death spread like wildfire across the city and beyond. Christian communities, once hidden in the shadows, now found their voices growing stronger. The faith that had once been seen as a quiet rebellion against Roman tradition had now become a beacon of resistance. Lawrence, the deacon who had been tortured and killed with the intent to extinguish his spirit, had instead ignited a fire that would burn for generations. As the news of his martyrdom spread, the reactions were not limited to Christians. Ordinary Romans who had come to the spectacle expecting to witness the defeat of a heretic were left to question everything they had been taught about strength and submission. Lawrence had not begged for mercy, had not given in to his pain. He had transformed his death into a testimony, a declaration of faith that defied the very notion of Roman power. Even the non-believers in the crowd began to whisper about the strange, almost supernatural strength that Lawrence had displayed. Christian leaders across the empire took Lawrence's example to heart. His calm defiance became the gold standard for martyrdom. His actions in the face of death transformed the way Christians viewed suffering, not as something to be feared or avoided, but as something that could be redeemed, something that could bring them closer to the divine. Lawrence's refusal to die in silence, his witty defiance, became a symbol of the triumph of faith over tyranny. What the Roman Empire had hoped would be the destruction of Christianity had instead become its greatest triumph. The imperial strategy, which had been to crush the church by killing its leaders and seizing its wealth, had backfired. The church, despite its losses, was growing stronger, more organized, and more determined than ever before. Lawrence's death did not extinguish the movement. It gave it the oxygen it needed to grow. In the years that followed, Lawrence's example inspired countless other Christians to stand firm in their faith. As the persecution intensified under Valerian and subsequent emperors, more and more Christians were martyred. Yet none would ever inspire the same level of devotion, of unwavering commitment to faith as Lawrence had. His death became a rallying cry for believers, a symbol that no matter the physical pain, no matter the cruelty of the empire, the spirit of Christianity could never be extinguished. Even the empire itself began to feel the shift. Valerian's persecution, which had been aimed at eradicating Christianity, only fueled its spread. In the face of extreme oppression, the faith began to attract more followers, not just in Rome, but throughout the empire. What was once a persecuted sect became a growing political and social force. By the time of Constantine's reign, a few decades later, Christianity would be not just tolerated, but embraced by the empire. A stunning reversal of fortune that could be traced directly back to the bold, unwavering stand of one man. Lawrence's legacy lived on in the very fabric of the empire. The church that had once been hunted down and destroyed by imperial forces was now becoming a dominant force in the Roman world. His death, rather than marking the end of Christianity, had paved the way for its eventual rise. Lawrence's courage and defiance had shown the Christian community that there was no power, no empire, no threat that could extinguish their faith. Centuries later, Lawrence's name would be revered as one of the greatest martyrs of Christianity, his feast day celebrated on August 10th each year. His story would be told again and again, not just as a tale of suffering and death, but as one of ultimate victory, a victory that would shape the future of Rome and the world beyond. The man who had smiled while being roasted alive, who had turned his torment into a defiant act of worship, had left an indelible mark on history. His spirit, his faith, and his courage had transcended the flames, living on long after his death. Lawrence, in his final moments, had not just defied the empire, he had shown the world that true strength does not lie in the power to destroy, but in the power to endure, to stand firm in one's convictions, no matter the cost.